third day at the Utopiales at Nantes. Was your first time, and what are your feelings?
It's my first time at a French science fiction gathering convention. Many times I've been to France, and I don't think I've ever been to Nantes either, so it's familiar to a degree, but a lot of it's very new to me. And Nantes is a very interesting city, and the convention is very impressively organised, and there seems to be a very vibrant genre field in France, which I think is tremendously encouraging. I've spoken to people and they say yes, it's vibrant, but it needs more money, but don't we all? So yeah, it's been a very enjoyable and encouraging experience as well for me as a writer who's relatively newly published in the French language to see the enthusiasm that there is for the genre over in France.
You sign a lot of books, I hope, and
yes.
I'm sure. Is there some question that a French reader asks you mostly, or is it?
I think mostly people tell me how much they like the book, which is great. And I think people are interested in, if they've read both the Light Ages and the Summer Isles, they're interested in the fact that they see the books as being so very different, and what you're going to do next, and do you try to write different books each time? So that's been something that quite a lot of people have asked me. I don't really know necessarily the answers to that question, but people do seem to comment on the variety of the fiction that I've written.
You speak about the variety of your fiction. How do you work? How does the idea come?
I think first of all I like writing and I enjoy writing, and so in a way there's this sort of need to find something to write about. Beyond that, I think you have ideas pass through your head. We all do. Wouldn't it be strange if, or it's odd that some particular thing goes on in the world, or you notice something, or a particular building, or a particular film, or something, and you respond to it, and it stays in your head. And I think if you sort of train yourself to be a writer, you tend to sort of cling on to those ideas and responses and stronger feelings, and as time goes on, you maybe link two things together, and it starts to form into a sort of pattern. And as I say, also because I want to write and I enjoy writing, you can try to force that process on a little bit by more deliberately trying to put things together and more deliberately building. And for most of the things that I've written, it's a relatively long period of gestation before I actually get to something that works.
Do you make a plan, or do you write directly to your novel or to your book?
I tend to plan more as time goes on. I think you have certain sorts of plots and situations which are fairly spontaneously arise because maybe they reflect a pattern in your own life, or you're referring to something that has a fairly clear-cut template in some way. I think if you want to carry on writing as a writer, you have to develop the craft side of things as well. So as years have gone by, I have become more structured and planned, but at the end of the day you have to take yourself by surprise as well. You have to stumble across things, and you have to be prepared indeed to rewrite and change things and throw things out. So it's a combination of inspiration and perspiration, I guess, and the amounts vary.
In the Light Age, you have some elements of kind of steampunk. You have elements of, we can say, fantasy, elements of science fiction. How do you have the idea to put all that together? Was it only a feeling or deliberate?
I think it was an atmosphere that I was creating first of all, and then I had to make sense of that atmosphere. I wanted certain things. I wanted the idea of fairly sort of industrial Victorian feel to streets that were still recognisably part of the English and indeed the European culture, but at the same time being able to turn the corner and find something which was stranger, more beautiful or more dangerous or more horrible than we would encounter in this world. And from that sort of desire, and I must say I did write some early pieces, some of which have stayed in the book relatively as, wouldn't it be nice if I could write this kind of thing, and actually string it together to make something. But then as the pieces started to work, the idea of ether and the concept of a development of a slightly different technology based upon a more occult, magical kind of industry, which had always been there in the background, sort of slowly evolved into something that I was able actually to turn into a clear premise. And I always, much though I love magical realist writing and fantasy writing, I always have a slight problem with books where the clocks start talking and the dead ancestors reappear and that sort of thing, which can be marvellous and liberating and wonderful and magical, but at the same time it can be quite destructive to any sort of sense of plot or tension, because if those sort of normal givens of reality don't matter at all, you know, the characters' needs and desires also can become, start to seem rather meaningless as well. So I was trying to find a logical underpinning for this basically fairly romantic desire to create this sort of slightly more wonderful vision of an industrial Victorian world.
We see that there is that we call a style of writing in your book. It's not only sentences and words. Do you work specially this kind of your writing?
I think some of the time I do. I like elegant writing, and I strive to make my own writing polished and elegant, and have to have a high level of finish and style. I think it's really down to the sort of people that I admire, both as writers and within other genres. It's not necessarily something I'm always proud of, because I think perfectionism is a very dangerous route for any kind of artist or writer to go in the direction of. But style, you know, that sort of extra glow that you get from something that's been done not only well, but with...
It's not only a story.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a nice chair that's okay to sit on is nice, but one that's got a real sort of, you know, you can see the grain of the wood and the joins and all of that are marvellously made, is something better again. So I guess, you know, intuitively, I try to make my work have that sort of high finish. Although, as I say, at the same time, I admire writers and other artists who are prepared to do things in a rough and ready way. And but certainly, I think, as far as the Light Ages is concerned, you know, the writing is quite consciously very rich. It's like a fruit cake, and you know, a fairly complex dish rather than a relatively simple dish if it was food. So, you know, once you start to write in that way, that's the way the book evolves.
And does the work on the style influence sometimes the story, or is the story always staying at the first plan?
Yeah, you can get sidetracked, I think. Sometimes I will start sentences not knowing how they're going to end, but knowing they're going to go da-da-dee-da-dee-dum-dee-dum-dee-dum-dum, or whatever. And so sometimes you're trying to find words that actually match the rhythm of the sentences, which I guess is a fairly poetic, not that I am a poet, but you know, I guess I'm using a sort of a more musical and poetic way of constructing sentences sometimes. And again, it's not necessarily something that I would always consciously strive to do, but I am aware of that. And you can obviously lead yourself up blind alleys in that way. And I think plot is very important. And obviously, it's one of the great things about the genre that it isn't just about character and setting. It is also about telling stories. And I think really the tension between the two is a good thing, and in general in the genre, and also it's a good thing for me as a writer to remind yourself that you need to move things on and you need to have things happening.
Do you see a difference between British and American steampunk?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm trying to think of examples, and they're coming into my mind. You know, we're thinking of something at the difference engine as opposed to China Mieville, for example. I think, yes, I think that there would be a difference. I think that, in a way, steampunk could potentially be more of something which we British could claim more as our own. In fact, we Europeans could claim more as our own, whereas the Americans are more likely to adopt it as a style. And so the difference between an English film set in Victorian times, directed by David Lean, say one of his Shakespeare, Dickens adaptations, and an American film set in Victorian London where it's foggy old London town sort of thing, which we love as well, I think, but I think the American take upon that sort of thing is different. Though, of course, I mean, steampunk and similar has been done in settings such as New York, but I think there's larger, there's a sort of a bigger sort of sense of landscape and newness to a lot of America, which doesn't fit quite so well into the steampunk mould. So off the top of my head, because it's never something I've really thought of before, but it's certainly an interesting point, I would say perhaps that we as Europeans can claim steampunk as more of our own, that Americans maybe can do it and do it well, but it's not quite so much their terrain. Whereas if you're talking perhaps of cyberpunk, for example, or certainly the more traditional Heinlein-based, Asimov-based science fiction, you could say perhaps that's more something that the Americans have got the original trademark on. So yeah, maybe it's something that is more ours.
You talk about the other writers. What kind or what writers do you read?
I read as widely as I can, first of all, so that means I tend not to linger on particular writers. And I read quite heavily outside the genre. I generally make a point, a pleasurable point, it has to be said, of reading year's best anthologies, the Datlow, Wilding fantasy anthology, the Gardner-Dozois year's best SF, or the Hardwell best SF. So I think first of all I read within the genre a lot of short fiction, and I always have. Particular writers within the genre who I admire. I grew up with the new wave of science fiction, so obviously writers like J.G. Ballard, Harlan Ellison, Brian Aldiss come very high up on the list.
John Brenner?
Yes, indeed. And also Keith Roberts, who's a fantastic stylist, and perhaps he didn't get the fame he deserved, but neither perhaps did he write as many books as he should have done and could have done as well. A frustrating writer in some ways, who showed such promise and did produce some absolutely brilliant stuff. And in terms of modern writers, I must say I do find when I look at who I'm reading in SF that it's a lot of female writers. I mean, Connie Willis I think is very good. I've just read The Speed of Dark by Elizabeth Moon, which I think is an exceptional work, and really crosses many boundaries and makes you think about all sorts of things. So I read quite a lot of the genre. It tends to come and go. Outside of the genre, I like writers who are strong stylists. So I'm a big admirer of some of the big American names like Philip Roth and John Updike outside the genre, and indeed Stephen King within the genre, because they just have such this sort of strong, vibrant sense of style, and they make it seem, I think Updike in particular is like Diego Maradona is in football. You just think, how can you make that seem so easy when I know it's so difficult? And I tend to follow sort of writers who are doing quite well at the time. So maybe if something's won a prize, like the Booker Prize in England, I'll read that. And I also read quite a lot of non-fiction, particularly historical fiction, or fiction about history.
You read a lot?
Yeah, I read a lot, yeah.
Because you know you have some writers who say, oh, since I'm writing, I don't read.
I don't have any more time to read.
I think that's okay for a while, but I was talking about this with some of the writers only yesterday, and you get people who will come to creative writing classes and say, I want to write, do you read much? Well, not really. And it's not impossible that you can succeed.
Yeah.
It's not impossible. The writer who wrote Papillon, Henry Scherer, I get the impression, certainly that was part of the myth, that he just sat down and, you know, this completely compelling book came out of him. But I think somewhere along the line you've got to be absorbing that sort of thing. Maybe some people are lucky enough to be able to absorb it by talking to friends in pubs and bars or whatever. But I think for most people, reading is very important. And I think just what happens over a period of time, if you don't do that, is that just your bank of ideas will slowly go lower and lower. So I'm fortunate, I think, to be able to have the time to read. And I think if people are considering writing and they want to earn some money at it, I think if they want to find another career, I'd advise them to find one that doesn't involve words and teaching English or anything like that, but to, you know, to be a scaffolder or a bricklayer or a forester, or, you know, work in a shop or something, rather than do, you know, try to write and maybe edit or publish, although I know many people who do that. But I think it's best to read as much as you possibly can and do other things as well, and then maybe your lifespan as a writer will hopefully be longer.
When you achieved the light age, for you, was it exactly the book you want at the beginning, at the origin of the idea, or did you say to yourself, "Oh, yes, but this"?
Yes, I think quite a lot of writers say that, you know, every book is a failure because you have this glowing vision. I think for me, and you know, the way I was describing the way I build up a book, I don't really know it's there till it's there. It's a little bit for me more like there's sculptors will say there's a statue within the stone and you have to liberate the statue from within the stone by chipping away at it. And for me, it's more like actually finding what is already there. I know that sounds, you know, it sounds a very mystical view of writing, which I don't necessarily have on a day-to-day basis. But I do have this feeling, you know, this idea, this character is so strong, it's so good, that there's got to be other things that I can put into it to make it stand up as a whole structure. So it's a very evolutionary process. Having said that, I obviously you do look back at your original idea, and I think in the context of the light ages, there were some things which I wanted to achieve in that book which just wouldn't fit, and I tried and tried and tried to squeeze them in, and they didn't fit. And that's okay, because you think, well, that's good, because that's an idea that I haven't used that I can use somewhere else. And other things, other ideas which you've been treasuring, you think, oh, that would be really, you know, maybe there's a novel in that or something, and then you realise it's just got sucked in and been used up in half a chapter, and, you know, it fits in. So it's a question of stepping back when you finished it. But what I envisage when the work's starting is quite hazy in comparison, I think. So I don't have a sufficiently clear vision, and I wouldn't want one to know exactly what it's going to be like.
And in the future, have you the idea to come back to this world, or is it the end of the story for you?
Normally, in most circumstances, as a reader and a writer, I like new books, and I'm not terribly keen on, you know, volume 2 and volume 3 of a particular series. Having said that, there are certain writers who have done that, who I greatly admire, and the one I most admire who's done this is outside the genre entirely. Thomas Hardy wrote his Wessex novel set in an imaginary county of England, and he said, for a good enough writer, I don't think he quite put it that way because he wasn't talking about praising himself, but a writer, if they're good enough, can set all of the great tragedies and triumphs of life into a relatively small space. You don't need the whole universe. And in a way, it seemed to me that the extra challenge of being able to pour new stuff into an existing container was interesting. So I have actually already written a successor novel to The Light Ages, which is set based around the same premise of ether in this industrialized yet magical world, called The House of Storms, which has been published in several countries, and I hope will be published in French. And I think there's probably another book in there which I'm starting to think about more and more. There are great advantages to reusing a world and a premise in terms of development lead in. Great advantage.
You have the already the background.
And I envy particularly detective writers. I think and they've got Inspector Jones, and they've got this constant, like Inspector Morse in Oxford, a very well known English detective writer, and it makes it a lot easier because you can just the new things that you want to say you can easily set in a context. So I have some mixed feelings about writing within the same area, but with this particular idea, the challenge still seems strong enough, and I will definitely be aiming to write what will be a third novel set in the same world. But it always would be my intention to have, as far as the reader was concerned, no particular reason to pick up the books in one order or another, or to have to read. If you enjoyed, you may not necessarily even find the next book is particularly similar in many ways. So I'm not looking to create a series as a writer, although I'd also recognise that from the point of view of the real world and publishers, and indeed readers, it sometimes helps to have something that carries on.
Actually, what is your new project?
Well, I have a new novel coming out in English next year, which is a near-future science fiction novel. It's basically a look back at this century from a woman who is basically, she's near death, and she's considering the leap into some sort of virtual intelligence, where her, in a way, everything that she's been in her personality in her life will be something that she brings with her. So it's obviously a time of considerable reassessment if you think about it, what actually happened and why you did things. So it's a very different book again from what I've written before, and I'm working on a book which is set in a slightly more alternate and twisted and magical version of Hollywood in the 1930s, which has been a slow build process really, much the way the Light Ages has, because of all the things I've been saying. But I know, that there's something there that's really strong and worth working on, and maybe after that I'll be returning to writing an ether novel with an element of space travel. I think I would like to get that far. People have said to me, it somehow just seems such an appealing idea that would it be possible to imagine this sort of culture going as far as some kind of space flight, and indeed having an English space program rather than an American one.